Good afternoon, friends. My name is Mikhail Korolyov. We are going forward. In 2014, when our country was really weak after the Maidan, the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the once fraternal state, Kolomoisky brought two looters to the leadership of the Dnipropetrovsk region. They had no connection to the revolution of dignity. Boris Filatov confirms the fact that he has no connection to the revolution of dignity in his own interview. Subsequently, they completely usurped the power in Dnipro and Dnipropetrovsk region and are waving a network of Kremlin agents in Ukraine. These two mediocrities are accustomed to appear precisely in difficult times and moments of weakness, but not to give a helping hand but to take away properties, real estate, lands, money, businesses and even lives. The only thing they succeed in is marauding, if it can be called a success, of course. You do not need to have any talents, intelligence or education to become a marauder. You need only one thing for this: a complete lack of moral values. This fatal mistake of Kolomoisky, deliberate or accidental, subsequently led to the Ilovaisk tragedy. In the summer of 2014, when the victory in Donbass was almost in our hands, the Ilovaisk tragedy occurred. It stopped the triumphant offensive of the Ukrainian army. Subsequently, Ukraine was dragged into the shameful Minsk negotiations, and the conflict in Donbass dragged on for 7 years. Let's consider the facts that led to the Ilovaisk tragedy. Using Kolomoisky's money, Korban formed volunteer battalions from active and patriotic young guys from our region, mainly from those who participated in Maidan. Gennady Korban confirms the fact that all battalions such as Dnipro, Artyomovsk, Donbass and others were formed personally by him and were under his total control. Korban has 3 sons, none of them volunteered. Korban and Filatov never left Dnipro during those events. An airplane with a full tank of fuel was constantly standing at the Dnipro airport to evacuate the scenes of Korban and Filatov in case of an uncontrollable situations. When it gets scary, hiding in flight is a common thing for the Dnipro usurpers. The volunteers got through rapid training and their responsibilities included cleansing of the already liberated territory from the remaining separatists, performing the functions of the police in the liberated territory, duty at checkpoints, checking of the documents and car trunks. The battalions were formed on the basis of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. They couldn't fight the regular armed forces of the Russian Federation since they were not technically equipped and did not possess military skills. All of them were peaceful Ukrainian citizens and had civilian professions. The volunteers performed auxiliary functions, for instance as doctors or firefighters or other non-military professions. The Anti-Terrorist Operation Command was under Armed Forces of Ukraine and Security Service of Ukraine control and did not apply to volunteer battalions. The battalions formed in Dnipro were legally subordinated to the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine and directly to the Deputy Governor of the Dnipropetrovsk region, personally to Korban. Events unfolded as follows. On the 5th of August in 2014, a plan of seizing the Ilovaisk by the forces of volunteer battalions was developed in Korban's office in the Dnipropetrovsk Regional Administration. The meeting, led by a former first-year student of the Moscow Drama University, Gennady Korban, was attended by General Ruslan Homchak, commanders of volunteer battalions Andrei Beletsky Azov, Andrei Filonenko Shakhtersk, Semyon Semenchenko Donbass, Yuri Bereza Dnipro 1 and their deputies, and also journalist Yuri Butuzov. Korban convinced the soldiers for this venture, deliberately misinforming them about the fact that according to reconnaissance, Ilovaisk was poorly fortified and practically not guarded, and also interested the battalion commanders in material rewards. Dnipro volunteer battalions, deceived and completely misinformed by Korban, set off on their last journey to liberate Ilovaisk. Ilovaisk turned out to be a perfectly fortified outpost, filled with concrete fortifications with a huge number of separatists inside. Despite the fierce resistance and the first deaths, part of Ilovaisk was taken under the control of Ukrainian volunteers within 2 weeks. The regular army of the Russian Federation approached the border with Ukraine during the seizure of Ilovaisk, and an invasion of Ukraine was predicted. The enemy's forces prevailed 17 times. World media began to talk about a possible invasion of Ukraine on all television channels. During the period from 20th to 24th of August, Russian regular forces entered the territory of Ukraine in the direction of Ilovaisk. On 26th of August in 2014, Ilovaisk with our volunteers inside was surrounded. The battalions Mirotvorets, Azov, Ivano-Frankivsk, which were not subordinated to Korban, successfully left Ilovaisk on the 25th of August. When the air smelled with the invasion of the regular forces of the Russian Federation, the battalions formed in the Dnipropetrovsk region could also leave this trap. But Korban's friend and accomplice, General Hamchak, forbade our patriots to leave Ilovaisk by his order. He confirms this fact in his interview.
І коли той генерал поїхав 25 серпня в штаб АТО там доповідати обстановку, моментально пішла, все, генерал поїхав.
During the operation in Ilovaisk, two generals were present. On the 25th of August, 3 battalions together with the police general successfully left Ilovaisk. The Dnipro battalions started to pack their things in order to leave Ilovaisk, too, as they understood that something had gone wrong. But General Hamchak stopped them by his order on the radio set and told that they are to stay in Ilovaisk. Hamchak had no legal rights to issue orders to volunteer battalions. If he hadn't intervened, not a single Ukrainian patriot would have died in this bloody corridor. Apparently, Hamchak was afraid of the failure of the FSB operation for the dastardly destruction of Ukrainian patriots. Hamchak takes responsibility for comments in Ilovaisk. A very important fact: the commander of the armed forces of the Russian Federation was a classmate of General Hamchak while he was studying at the Moscow military school.
Командуючим армією, російською армією був
General Hamchak confirms this fact at his interview.
Генерал, який зі мною разом в одній роті навчався в училищі.
Hamchak could talk to a classmate to avoid bloodshed, but for some reason he didn't. Did you have an opportunity to speak to the Russian Federation general? There wasn't, and I didn't look for it. Ilovaisk was under the control of Ukrainian volunteers. The most correct decision at the time was to hold the defense until the arrival of the reinforcements. Ilovaisk was firmly fortified and literally flooded with concrete. Weapons and food were plentiful, and most importantly, losses during the defense and attack are calculated as 1 to 3. That is, to destroy 1,000 Ukrainians, the Russians would have to sacrifice at least 3,000 of their people. Hamchak begins to negotiate with the commander of the Russian troops under the call sign Director about a green corridor, while simultaneously involving the Kiev command in this process so that they negotiate with Moscow at a higher level. This is a blatant fact of sabotage. Instead of fortifying in Ilovaisk and preparing to hold the defense and demanding reinforcements of the regular army of the armed forces of Ukraine, Hamchak, Korban's friend and accomplice, initiated negotiations about the green corridor. The Russians were confident that the volunteers will be led to a certain death along the bloody green corridor and started preparing firing points exactly in the place where Hamchak's order will later lead them to slaughter. It was reported from Kiev that there were no guarantees of an exit through the green corridor, since they cannot give conditions for an exit without weapons. Hamchak was advised either not to leave at all, to fortify in Ilovaisk and wait for reinforcements, or if he has decided to leave at his own peril and risk, then he has to do that in small columns, in the opposite direction from the bloody corridor along a wide front in small groups, so as not to expose everyone at once to the fatal danger.
Питання вирішили, боєприпасів було більш чим достатньо. Я хочу навіть того, скільки їх там було кинуто, і після цього скільки...
The chief of the general headquarters of the armed forces of Ukraine confirms the fact that they recommended Hamchak to enter and fortify in Ilovaisk. Food and weapons were plentiful. This can be witnessed by battalion commanders, their deputies and ordinary soldiers. But Hamchak took the decision to leave through the green corridor without having guarantees about safeness of the battalions.
без гарантії того, що
Contrary to the Kiev Command recommendations of the armed forces of Ukraine, Ruslan Hamchak gave the order to our soldiers to disarm, take only light weapons, line up in two columns, and start moving through the corridor where Russian troops had equipped firing points. Even though the commander of the armed forces of the Russian Federation under the call sign director told Hamchak by radio said that there were no confirmation and guarantees from Moscow that the Ukrainian battalions can leave through the Green Corridor and they will start shooting, Hamchak gives the order to leave the Ilovaisk. The journalist Rostislav Shapashnikov, who took part and witnessed this tragedy, captured all events and conversations on his video camera. While being at the car, we heard all the conversations by the radio set. Particularly, Russian command said that negotiations still continue and requested Ukrainian battalions to wait a bit. Sergei Nasilevets, the deputy of the 39th BTO commander who also took part in this operation, witnesses the fact that they heard the conversation between Hamchak and the Russian negotiator under the call sign director by the radio set. Russia demands 15 minutes to finish negotiations at the highest level in Moscow. Hamchak answers that he doesn't have even 2 minutes and gives the order to volunteer battalions to leave Ilovaisk. The point is that the negotiations haven't been finished yet, but we got the order to start moving. There were a lot of questions about this. Initially, we didn't have the task to break through. We received the task to pack the weapons, transform to travel mode and move to the safe area to Starobeshevo. But at the time of the battle, in the process of shelling, General Hamchak gave the order to break through.
Изначальной информации не было такого, что мы должны прорываться с боем. То есть была задача спаковать оружие, перейти в походный режим и двигаться в сторону Старобешева, на безопасную территорию. Но уже в процессе боя, уже в процессе обстрела от генерала Хамчака поступила команда прорываться с боем.
30-я булава прием. Булава, я стою за тобой, у меня 3 километра, колонна длиной. Все машины легко уничтожаемые. Начинает движение. Прием. Движение пошло движение. Тут не только ваши, тут все. Сип, я 4001. У нас ебанут минометы по колонне, в деревне, как приняли прием. Я понял, я сказал всем вперед. Скорость максимальная, всем вперед.
А что такое легко уничтожаемые машины? Как я зафиксировал на свою видеокамеру, это обычные маршрутки, бусики, которые были сняты с рейсов.
Our guys in civilian minibuses having only light weapons with them came under fire from all types of heavy weapons of the Russian army. General Hamchak, having abandoned the soldiers and the radio set in his car, fled at night, taking a thermal imager and the battalion commander of the Dnipro 1, Yuri Bereza, with him. Hamchak says that he had the only purpose to get out of Ilovaisk. Did you feel the responsibility for the lives of your soldiers? You had the biggest responsibility at that situation. There is such a profession to defend the motherland. This is how soldiers tell their children about their profession. When the enemy comes to your land and kills your brothers, then this is the best moment to destroy him.
Я туди приїхав своєю
Did you have any
особистою
kind
зброєю,
of
пістолет,
weapons
який в
and
мене
did you
здатний.
use it? I arrived to Ilovaisk with my personal gun. By the way, I haven't used it at all. Then I took the bigger weapon and went out of the surrounding with it. He says that he personally haven't shot it at the enemy at all.
Ні, я особисто не стріляв.
An interesting fact is that General Ruslan Hamchak never fired at the enemy during the Ilovaisk tragedy, when hundreds of our volunteers were dying from the bullets of the aggressor's army. Apparently, Russian troops which were killing Ukrainian soldiers were not an enemy for Hamchak. In Moscow universities, together with Korban, they were definitely recruited to the FSB. Ruslan Hamchak draws the parallel in his interview between Maidanists, patriotic volunteers and sailors during the revolution in 1917, focusing on the fact that after the victory of the revolution all the sailors were very quickly destroyed by the Bolsheviks under unknown circumstances.
Якщо ви знаєте,
Are you aware of the fate of those sailors who went to Smolny? After the victory, they were destroyed by the Bolsheviks, as the active mass isn't needed by anyone. Active mass. This is how Hamchak and Corbyn call our patriots who can prevent the usurpers from bringing Ukraine to its knees and conducting subversive work of the Kremlin agents here.
Те люди, которые погибли в Иловайском котле, были невыгодны как и российской власти.
Alexander Svinarenko, the participant of the Ilovaisk tragedy, witnesses that the volunteers were gathered all together in Ilovaisk in order to be destroyed. What is Corbyn's role in this tragedy? He gathered patriots into volunteer battalions, active mass, under patriotic slogans who learned to organize and fight back any authority of the usurpers. Then Corbyn, luring the battalion commanders with money, organizes a trap in Ilovaisk, deliberately misinforming about the real situation in Ilovaisk and near the border with the Russian Federation. He also sends his friends and accomplices Hamchak to Ilovaisk so that he can implement their dastardly plan to destroy the patriots, the active mass, step by step.
до чого та активна маса потрібна кому?
Fact number 1. Corbyn possessed all the information regarding everything that was happening in the east of Ukraine since the beam listening devices were deployed. All the intercoms of the separatists were listened to up to Rostov, and Corbyn was aware of any unauthorized movement of weapons, armored vehicles, Russian troops across the border of Ukraine.
Занималась не таможней, не баблом, не экономикой.
Corbyn confirms that the beam listening devices were deployed, and he was aware and controlled everything what was happening at the east of Ukraine. Fact number 2. Corbyn knew about the invasion of the Russian troops to Ukraine since not only all the separatist intercoms were wiretapped up to Rostov, but also they were informants on the whole uncontrolled territory.
Были организованы группы патриотов, которые находились на оккупированных территориях.
Corbyn confirms that the beam listening devices were deployed, and he was aware and controlled everything what was happening at the east of Ukraine.
Через границу Украины. Несанкционированных передвижениях колонн, оружия, живой силы, техники и так далее, и так далее.
Corbyn himself confirms that the invasion was expected. The journalist asks if the invasion was expected or no. Corbyn answers that the invasion was definitely expected. What did Corbyn do? He transmitted this information to Ilovaisk that there was no invasion of Russian troops and wouldn't be.
Перший командир батальйону Дніпро-1 Юрій Береза, власне, зараз цитата.
The first commander of the battalion Dnipro-1, Yuri Bereza, confirms the fact that he was worried what would happen if Ilovaisk will be surrounded by Russian troops. But Dnipropetrovsk regional administration told the commanders that there is no invasion and wouldn't be.
Командири добровольчих батальйонів, люди з Дніпропетровської обласної держадміністрації, колеги-військовики.
And then he modestly transfers information about the invasion not to the soldiers who were in Ilovaisk but to the general headquarters in Kiev, who did not have the legal rights to give orders to the volunteer battalions which were formed in the Dnipropetrovsk region. All the information was transferred to general headquarters in Kiev by us. Thus, Corbyn had sent volunteers to certain death, but at the same time he expected to avoid criminal liability, shifting it on other people as he always does after contract killings. It would be enough for Corbyn to make just one phone call to Ilovaisk and warn our volunteers about the invasion of the regular forces of the Russian Federation, so that the unprepared guys would return to their positions in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Corbyn hadn't done that. Hadn't warned. This is not just negligence from his side. It was done deliberately to destroy the real Ukrainian patriots, the active mass, who could later prevent Corbyn and people like him from robbing and destroying our country. Even before the Revolution of Dignity, there is a systematic series of episodes with contract killings, including political ones similar in handwriting, where Corbyn had a clear motive to be the customer of these killings, since the property of the victims passed into the ownership of Corbyn and his puppets. Before the Revolution of Dignity, Ukrainian authorities were completely controlled by the KGB FSB of the Russian Federation. Corbyn uses the same simple murder scheme with the subsequent seizure of the property of the victims. Despite the obvious motives, system and handwriting, Corbyn was never introduced to the status of a suspect, which suggests that Corbyn worked closely and enjoyed the patronage of the pro-Kremlin government. In the case of Ilovaisk, everything goes according to the same scheme. Firstly, the murders of patriots, of the active mass, who will interfere with the plunder of the country, then the usurpation of power and personal enrichment of Corbyn and his slaves at the expense of taxpayers. I have absolutely no doubt that Corbyn has been hooked by the FSB and has been conducting subversive work in our country for a long time. Corbyn very often refers to the Torah and hides behind the Jewish people while covering up his grave crimes. According to Torah, the main idea is that you have to save your life at any cost. For instance, the soldiers from Israeli army have the right and won't be judged for handing over the positions of their army to enemy to save their life. Corbyn, because of his stupidity and meanness, substitutes the entire Jewish people, including the guarantor of the Constitution of Ukraine. About 500 people died, more than 300 were taken prisoner, and hundreds were wounded and maimed in the Ilovaisk tragedy. This is a whole ethnic group of real Ukrainian patriots who were organized and sent to a certain death by Corbyn's cunning. In this case, Corbyn had several motives. Fulfillment of the next FSB task for the dastardly destruction of Ukrainian patriots. And he decided to become the master in the Dnipropetrovsk region and enter the politics of Ukraine, but with the active mass, patriots who had passed the Maidan and Ato, this desire is simply not feasible. That basically happened. Corbyn, stepping over this tragedy, entered the big politics of Ukraine without hesitation. Spending a lot of money, which was most likely received from the Kremlin, he began to participate actively in Ukrainian politics. Firstly, the elections for deputies in Chernihiv district, then elections for the mayor of Kiev, then he headed the Okrop consignment, and for the last 7 years he has been robbing the budget of Dnipro. He has put dozens of his puppets in the branches of the central government, finances and openly supports the separatist consignment of Putin's godfather opposition platform За життя. Firstly, he brought to Nice and then bought all the opposition of the Dnipropetrovsk region, including the pro-Kremlin one. Now Corbyn is preparing his new consignment proposition to enter the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine and his hand-slave Filatov to become a president, having once again deceived the current president Volodymyr Zelensky. Our fighters were killed by the troops of the Russian Federation, but the synchronized actions and inactions led directly to the prepared trap by Corbyn and Hamchak. Taking into account all the events and then the consequences, it is clearly traced that Corbyn, Hamchak and the Russian troops acted harmoniously according to a previously agreed plan, the purpose of which was to destroy the real patriots of Ukraine, who wouldn't allow the subversive work of enemy special services on the territory of our country. The causal relationship is clearly traced. With the naked eye, it is clear that the Ilovaisk tragedy is a planned joint operation of the enemy special services with the active participation of recruited agents, Corbyn, Hamchak and other defendants. The evil led by Corbyn systematically covers Ukraine. The time has come to stop these marauders, and no one except us will do this. A huge number of Russian troops have been constantly at the borders of Ukraine and are ready to attack our country at any time since April 2021. We see that the organizers of the Ilovaisk tragedy have got away with the murder of Ukrainian patriots for 7 years already. If we swallow it now, the murders of our citizens will enter the system. The scheme of killing patriots in the Ilovaisk cauldron by usurpers is perfectly worked out. According to Article 5 of the Constitution of Ukraine, the people are the source of power in our country. I am appealing on behalf of several public organizations to law enforcement agencies with a request to arrest Gennady Korban and Ruslan Hamchak on suspicion of treason to the motherland. The Ilovaisk tragedy is a joint operation of the Russian Federation troops and traitors to the motherland in the branches of Ukrainian authorities. All the entourage and contacts of these people should be brought into the status of possible recruited agents. These are officials, military personnel, business representatives. To impose sanctions, freeze accounts and assets, prohibit leaving the territory of Ukraine and take appropriate measures during the investigation. I ask the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky, to take this issue under your personal control.
Здесь погибли ребята. Прямое попадание. Вон впереди машина.
Our Ukrainian guys died right here. That was a direct hit. I'm not going to show you the killed bodies. You do not need that. We just had a bad day today. Just a bad day.
Сегодня у нас плохой день.